Today's webinar will be in two parts. The first part will be an introduction to the REAP scheme, just briefly. Then myself, Paul Corrigan, I'm the Program Manager of the Certified Environmental Practitioner scheme. I'll give a brief presentation on the CEnvP Impact Assessment Specialist certification and how that may fit into the REAP scheme. Then I'll hand over to Felicity Greenway, who's the Executive Director of State Planning Policies, Strategic Advice of New South Wales Planning of Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, to speak in detail on the Registered Environmental Assessment Practitioner scheme, giving an overview how it fits in with certification of EISs under the Rapid Assessment Framework, and then after the presentation, then there'll be a Q&A panel with herself and planning directors that have been supporting the development of the REAP, and that is Sarah Pesh and Brian Conang. Now, with the webinar today, you'll find there's a chat function. If you have any questions during, please add them into the chat. The staff from the Department of Planning will monitor the chats and pull them together and try to address those at the Q&A panel. And if there's any tricky questions that can't be answered on the time, because we have the details here, we'll be able to follow up, or they should be able to follow up afterwards and try and answer those in due course. First, a brief intro on the REAP scheme. It's currently on exhibition as part of the Rapid Assessment Framework. It's an accreditation scheme for suitably qualified and experienced environmental assessment practitioners to be established by the New South Wales Department of Planning to enhance quality assurance for environmental assessment for major project applications in New South Wales. The REAP scheme is designed to ensure a high standard for key environmental assessment documents through certification process, improve the quality of environmental assessment for major projects, reduce application delays, increase public confidence in the planning system. To be recognised as a REAP, all you're going to require is to be certified as a member of an accredited and registered professional scheme. There'll be a number of those applying. CEnvP, who I represent, is confident that the Impact Assessment Specialist certification meets the requirements of the REAP scheme, and at the appropriate time we'll be making an application to be accredited and registered in the EPA regulation for our certified impact assessment specialists. Now, I've just done a brief comparison, and Felicity will discuss detail the proposed guidelines and becoming a REAP, but this table highlights how the impact assessment certification from CEnvP meets the current proposed requirements. As you can see, both of them marry up quite well. And for further detail, all our guidelines for becoming a CEnvP Impact Assessment Specialist are available to be viewed on our website. Background on who CEnvP is. We're now in our 17th year. It's an initiative of the Environment Institute of Australia and New Zealand. It was designed to certify individuals rather than academic courses. And it was, I guess, originally put together to meet a growing demand from community for greater environmental accountability for industry and government. Now, there's nearly 950 CEnvPs across Australia, New Zealand and the world. With time, CEnvP has built a robust scheme which conforms to ISO 17024's requirements for bodies operating certification as a persons. And CEnvP has built the technology and has the governance systems in place to support influx of new applications when they come through. There's currently 8 certification types, 7 of which are specialisations. When certified as a specialist, you also meet and gain general certification.
Paul, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but could you share your screen again, please? I think some people just can't see the presentation.
Can that be seen again?
Yes. Great, thank you.
So this screen is just what I was speaking to. I heard that we're unable to see, some people are unable to see the presentation. Why do people become certified? There's a range of reasons. Some of those include personal ethics, desire to improve standards, gain a competitive edge. We had a survey recently which looks at those motivations, and they're some of the key reasons for people becoming certified. Another reason is regulation, and there's increasing regulator obligations with reference to certification in over a dozen areas of regulation. Specific detail can be found on the CEnvP website in our About Us section, the benefits of the certification. What's in an application to become certified as an environmental impact assessment specialist? You require an environment-related degree, 10 years of full-time equivalent experience in environmental practice over the last 15 years. A minimum of 5 of those must be impact assessment specific, and of those, at least 3 years must be supported by documentary evidence, such as reports, other publications. You need referees from esteemed environmental professionals in their field, detailed CV, detailed evidence the applicant's competent and active, substantiated through submission of publications, reports have been written, etc. And an ongoing commitment to continued professional development, and every 2 years at recertification, it's required to submit evidence of achieving 100 points of CPD over that period of time. Once submitted, the application, it's quite a detailed process. There's quite a lot of rigour within it. We have an administration review. That's when it comes into the office, and everything's checked to make sure it's all in order. It then gets passed on to a registrar for screening, and that's where a deep dive is taken upon the application by a CEnvP impact assessment specialist. At that time, if they've determined the applicant has enough of the required skills, competencies and knowledge to proceed, it then returns to the office, and the office then organises a panel of 3 CEnvPs to again review, interview. At the point of the interview, which takes 2.5 hours, a report will be written up, collated and submitted to the CEnvP Board Application Review Committee, who again reviews the whole application, the panel reports feedback, and then makes a recommendation to the CEnvP Board, who sets every 6 to 8 weeks to review all applications, and they'll either accept, defer or reject an application, and advise the outcome to the applicant via the office. That's the process. Let's just try to give a quick overview there. The process can take around 3 months from submission, but some can take longer to progress due to maybe chasing up referees, requesting more detail, organising interviews, requesting more reports written, etc. I guess what we'd recommend is getting ahead of the pack and applying today to start that application process, and all our details can be found on our website, or give us a call or email. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I will now be handing over to Felicity Greenway to present on the REAP scheme.
Thanks very much for that, Paul. Can people hear me online? Just a thumbs up? Fantastic. Look, just before I get started, I'll just remind people, if you want to enter a question, on the top of your screen, there's a few icons. There's a little kind of raise your hand icon, but there's in between the people icon and that, there's a little notepad. That's where you can see the chat room and enter questions in. So Ben and the team here are going to be monitoring as we go through the presentation this afternoon. Look, it's a really exciting day for the team and we in the lead up to Christmas, obviously doing a lot of work on this assessment reform package, and it is a kind of a very significant thing in that I think with these changes, it's probably one of the most significant changes to the New South Wales, major projects assessment system, probably for the next decade, I'd say, and a significant kind of lift of the industry. Look, before also I get into the presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we variously meet. I'm in Talawalada today in the Rocks on Gadigal country. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people joining us for the session today. Environmental impact assessment and measuring, documenting, understanding impacts to country is a really important thing to us all. So yeah, I'd like to again acknowledge Aboriginal people joining us today on this session. So what is the REAP scheme? And thank you, Paul, for that introduction. I think you've covered a lot of ground already, but maybe I'll go to a bit of the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we introducing this scheme? And it is for a variety of reasons. So we'd really like to see if we can raise the bar across the sector on the quality of assessments. Not to say that the quality is poor in any sense, but like any kind of industry, there are differing standards across the sector, and so we'd like to really drive consistency as well across the sector. And in driving that consistency, we think we'd also like to create greater standardisation in environmental impact assessment documentation. And we think genuinely that this is going to assist us in driving down assessment timeframes, which is obviously a key focus of government at the moment. Another key reason for embarking on this REAP scheme and the reform package more broadly is around making it easier for the community and stakeholders to access documentation and their understanding of how these major projects will affect them and their lives. And lastly, but certainly not least, we really want to introduce this REAP scheme because we think it's going to overall improve the integrity of the impact assessment system, the planning system, and that is also in response to one of the recommendations in the CALDOS review into governance in the planning system. So the REAP scheme aims to, as Paul was saying, ensure that the EISs for all major projects are prepared to a high standard, having regard to the new guidance material for state significant development and state significant infrastructure that we've developed. So the REAP scheme is part of this broader assessment reform package that is on exhibition. It's on exhibition until the 12th of February, so there's still a couple of weeks remaining. And the three main components of the reform package are around streamlining major project assessments by introducing what we've got is industry-specific assessment requirements for certain industry sectors. We've also wanting to improve the efficiency and outcomes of of the major project system by introducing new guidance material that step-by-step explanation of the major projects system and how to go about preparing an EIS and community engagement. So there's guidelines for SSD, SSI, cumulative impact and community engagement. And lastly, but certainly not least, we want to enhance the quality assurance of our major project system by introducing this certification of EISs through the REAP scheme. So just moving on to the next slide, there's two key aspects to the proposed REAP scheme, or two key kind of functions. First, the draft regulation that's on exhibition the regulation will ultimately identify certain professional schemes whose members are suitably skilled and qualified and experienced professionals in the field of environmental assessment, and those members of the scheme will be given statutory recognition as registered environmental assessment practitioners. So just in summary again, so the reg ultimately will name the schemes and the members of those schemes will be registered environmental assessment practitioners. The second core function of the regulation is that it will require all EISs for state significant development and state significant infrastructure to be certified by a registered environmental assessment practitioner, so a REAP. Before they are submitted for exhibition, for public exhibition. So they're the two core functions of the regulation and the REAP scheme. So in terms of some of the nuts and bolts on what's going to happen, how do we recognise these professional schemes? So organisations such as EIA NZ seeking to have their professional schemes recognised as a REAP scheme will need to apply to the department for accreditation. So applications are going to be assessed against criteria following the steps that are outlined in the draft guideline, the REAP guideline that is also on exhibition. So organisations such as EIA NZ and PIA may seek accreditation of their existing professional schemes, and we indeed understand that to be the case, while other organisations may set up new professional schemes to comply with the provisions. So after the REAP schemes are listed in the regulation, members of each scheme then will be able to carry out the statutory duty of REAPs, including certifying EISs for SSD and SSI applications, or state significant development and state significant infrastructure applications. So look, to ensure that REAPs and organisations remain accountable, we're going to, in the department, have over time an audit function over time, and periodically reviewing the REAP schemes over time as well. So just stepping through in a bit more detail exactly what the proposed criteria are for the professional schemes. So step by step, firstly around the issue of qualifications, the expectation is that practitioners must have an environmental or planning related degree. This requirement may be waived in exceptional circumstances if, for instance, the practitioner has over 10 years experience in environmental planning practice and has demonstrated a high level of competency in the practice. Another criteria is around the length of experience. So the proposal is that practitioners must have at least 10 years of full-time equivalent experience in environmental or planning practice. In terms of skills, there is quite a comprehensive skill set we see. Practitioners must have extensive knowledge of the environmental assessment process, including regulatory requirements around community engagement, as well as the application of government plans and policies and guidelines to the assessment of projects. It'd be strong technical expertise is a must as well, including the ability to identify and scope impacts, understand and collect baseline information, identify measures to avoid and minimise impacts, predict impacts, assess impacts against established criteria, identify measures to monitor and review impacts, and deal with the uncertainties associated with many of the issues that crop up on these major projects. Strong analytical skills is another must, including the ability to think critically, conceptualise and solve problems, interpret and synthesize a lot of technical information, and evaluate those complex multidisciplinary studies, and understand and consider competing views that often crop up in these major projects. Along the same lines, strong evaluation skills are really required, including the ability to evaluate the impacts of a project as a whole, looking at by interpreting government policy, integrating the findings of the technical studies, and weighing up and measuring those things and the competing views that emerge, and assessing then the overall merits of the project as a whole. Finally, in terms of that technical expertise, high-level communication skills is, can't be underestimated in having to perform all those, coordination, interpretation, synthesization. Effective communication and high-level communication skills is an absolute must, and that ability especially to reflect community views in the documentation. So on the, I guess on the other side of the coin, in terms of expectations around what the schemes themselves, what the department and the panel we expect will be looking at is that the professional scheme has a strong corporate governance, including a governing body, an established professional ethical code of conduct, clear operational policies, particularly around procedures for handling complaints and taking any disciplinary action when necessary. We will be looking to see that the professional schemes have a robust process for evaluating the qualifications and experience of the members of the schemes before they're admitted to the scheme. And importantly, I think Paul mentioned already, as part of the existing scheme that the organisation runs, that a requirement around ongoing continuing professional development will be a must as well, including, for example, presenting at conferences, publishing research or journal material, lecturing, or taking courses and the like. So a little bit more on the accreditation process, and not really wanting to get too bogged down, because this is very much in the near future, but still work in progress. There are various steps that we'll be following post exhibition of the package. And that includes organisations applying to the Planning Secretary for accreditation of a professional scheme. There'll be the Planning Secretary then is going to establish a panel to evaluate the applications for scheme accreditation. The panel is going to be made up of representatives from the department, agencies that are involved in the assessment of major projects, people from the environmental assessment industry and the community. The panel will evaluate the applications and make recommendations to the Planning Secretary. I'd probably describe the Planning Secretary then as a conduit to the Minister, an administrative conduit where the Secretary will either accept or not the recommendations of the panel, and then the Minister will ultimately decide if the schemes are approved and the regulation is amended to reflect the approved schemes. So in terms of what exactly are the tasks of a REAP, it is about the certification of EISs ultimately. Initially, all EISs for state significant development and state significant infrastructure will need to be certified by a registered environmental assessment practitioner. So it could be that in the future, let's not get ahead of ourselves, but it could be, for example, in the future, we expanded this scheme to include EISs for regionally significant DAs that are designated development, but that is for a future kind of Felicity and team to think about. We're going to get the scheme off and running to start with major projects. So the matters requiring certification in these, the forms will be broader than just the current statutory requirements in the existing EP&A reg, and will extend beyond statutory compliance to cover matters relating more to the form and content and general quality of EISs and environmental assessment report. And I'll touch on these in more detail in the next slide, but certification requirements are designed to improve the quality of these environmental assessment documents. So they're seeking to ensure that EISs are robust, they're easier to understand, they promote informed public debate on the merits of projects and support informed decision making on these complex, big and often controversial projects. To certify that assessment documents have been prepared by a suitably qualified professional, a REAP will need to complete the relevant form at the time of lodging, and this is all going to be done via the major projects website and the planning portal. So just quickly running through certification matters, because I can see on the right hand side there's a number of questions, and so I really want to get to those. But again, just down to quickly running through the nuts and bolts of what exactly are REAPs certifying. So matters to certify in an EIS may include, has it complied with guidance and statutory requirements, contains all relevant project information, no false or misleading statements, contains a consolidated project description, addresses the Secretary's environmental assessment requirements, contains accurate summary of engagement findings, contains detailed technical assessment of project impacts, and contains easy to understand evaluation of the impacts against the ESD principles. I mean, yeah, so, no issue there really. Okay. In terms of more kind of process things, SSD, in selecting a REAP, SSD and SSI proponents will be responsible for selecting a REAP who will work on their project and certify the EIS for the project. So the proponent should appoint a REAP, we would say as early as possible at the outset of a project, so that the practitioner can play, you know, a major role in the development of the EIS, and, you know, undertaking the engagement and synthesizing all those reports as they come in. We think this may avoid unnecessary delays, really, down the line. Certification of the document. So on completion of the EIS, the REAP will be required to review the whole document and certify that it complies with the requirements set out in the relevant form, following which the proponent can then submit the document to the department via the website. So the department will do still a quick high-level check of the EIS, including reviewing the REAP certification before putting the EIS on public exhibition. This is by no means an adequacy review, though, like of days of old. We're talking about a couple of days max. So we're really looking at trying to compress the assessment timeframes, as we said. In terms of making a complaint about REAPs, anyone who's dissatisfied with the performance of a REAP will be required to lodge a complaint with the organisation that administers the relevant REAP scheme. And the organisation will investigate the complaint, including with its relevant operational policies. Look, it is the organisation's response to dealing with complaints such as that will be obviously a focus as the department periodically reviews the schemes or audits the schemes. That sort of history would be a factor that we'd obviously look into. So just to finish off where we are in the process, as I said, the team and I were working feverishly up until Christmas in developing this package. It isn't an entirely new package. There are some new elements, but it had a previous life known as the Environmental Impact Improvement Project, I think. So there are many elements of that we've built on and brought to exhibition again. But the accreditation scheme and the draft reg, brilliant new things here. We're aiming to have the EP&A reg, a final reg that gives effect to the reform package and the REAP scheme made by July 2021 this year. This should include recognition of at least the initial REAP schemes. And it may be that other schemes come online later in the year. The REAP scheme document certification is expected to start operating within 6 to 12 months of the proposed amendments to the reg, but we haven't decided on the exact kind of timing at this stage, and it's something we'll work in tandem with the organisations applying on, because the one thing we do want to ensure is obviously there are sufficient REAPs in the system to certify the 100 or so major projects the department receives each year. So to ensure an orderly transition to the new scheme, we will also orchestrate appropriate transitional arrangements for application, and so that it's not switched on overnight. There's sufficient time for the organisations to accredit members, and there's a sufficient pool of REAPs available. So look, I am conscious of time, and I do want to leave the remaining time now to to Q&A. So to help us with that, just remind you that the chat function is available, although I can see there's a great deal of questions. Ben Lusher, who's the director of the Planning System Productivity and State Policy team, he's going to moderate some of the questions and field them to myself and the panelists, Sarah Pesh and Brian Cullinane. I'd also just like to quickly acknowledge my other teammates, Adam Rozalki and Andrei Shibansky, who's also online, who've worked, done the hard yards in developing this package that we're bringing to you. Okay, so let's, Ben, I might hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Felicity, and thanks everyone for all those questions that have already been posted in the meeting chat. Please keep them coming through. We're thrilled at the interest that we're seeing. We're keen to field these questions and comments along with any other ones you may put in. So we'll jump into those in a moment with the Q&A panel. And in doing that, I'd just like to introduce Sarah Pesh and Brian Cullinane, who've been key contributors to this initiative, and together with Felicity, they're the Q&A panel for today to respond to those comments. I've seen quite a lot of questions earlier on come in about the CEnvP, and before we jump into the Q&A panel discussion, I just thought, Paul, I might throw back to you to see if there's anything that you wanted to cover off. I know I can see you've been answering those questions diligently in the chat, but just wanted to make sure that you're happy that you've covered any of those points off before we move on to the REAP scheme questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, as you see, I'm madly trying to answer them as they're coming in. I'm a fair bit behind. Nothing really. The only thing I'd recommend is to go to our website, CEnvP.org. That has 80% of the questions that I'm answering at the moment across it, but I'm leading people to the exact pages. And if there's anything bigger, see a big one there from Jorg I'm currently answering, is to email it through to us. Then we can also vet it past some registrars for a bit more detail, which might help them along. Thanks, Ben.
Fantastic, Paul. Thanks very much. So, as mentioned, we'll naturally endeavour as well to answer all of your questions, but if we do need to take any on notice, we'll be sure to come back to you and follow up after today's session, just to make sure we've covered off all the questions and inquiries. So I might now jump into some of these comments that have been coming through. There's some really interesting and insightful questions, and the first one that I'll jump to from Warwick, which is the REAP has a big responsibility to the broader community to act impartially and help build trust in the EA process. 100% agree, Warwick. It's suggested that a skill set of importance is professional skepticism, with the ability to identify biases and the courage to say so, even in the face of upsetting the proponent. Will DPI require this capacity? Felicity, I might throw that one to you to start with, if that's okay.
Thanks for that one, Warwick, and good to see you online. Look, I think you're absolutely right. I completely agree that some healthy skepticism in this sector is an absolute requirement. We can call it healthy skepticism, or another way of putting it might be like a true kind of independent or objective analysis and evaluation of a project. And that's what genuinely the REAP scheme is trying to reinforce. Over many years, there has been criticism of the planning system and the major project system in particular, that that practitioners are in the pockets of developers and the like. This scheme is really, it is being developed to directly address those sorts of community concerns and drive integrity and accountability across the sector. whether or not I think it's an interesting question whether there needs to be an additional criteria around independence. I had thought that it was an inherent part of preparing an EIS is an independent and objective evaluation of the impacts of a project. But certainly if there's suggested wording or additional comments, please, and that's the other thing, we should state that we are on exhibition and we welcome feedback on any aspect of the reform package, and obviously particularly including the REAP scheme.
Thanks very much, Felicity. The further question had come in from Miles Ellis, which I might throw to Brian, if okay, Brian. And the question is, for those assessing SSD, do they have any comeback against a REAP certified EIS if they're not a REAP themselves?
So does that mean if the person assessing the project on the government side is not a REAP?
That's my read of the question, Brian. That's right. So if an assessment, I presume assessment officer at the department is looking at an EIS critically, what is their recourse through the merit assessment if they're not necessarily a certified REAP themselves?
Yeah, so from the government assessment side, the main thing that the assessor will be looking for is that the criteria that we're asking the REAP to certify, there's actually evidence that they have been met within the EIS, and that is the main responsibility and function of the assessment officer in relation to those REAP requirements. I think there is a broader discussion going on in government, and probably a longer term discussion about what competencies and abilities and qualifications the government side assessment officers and decision makers need to have. So I know there is some thought going on about that. But from the specific perspective of the REAP system, the assessment officer will be concerned about is there evidence that the certification criteria have in fact been met.
Thanks very much, Brian. Sorry about the delay there. I have another interesting question that's come in from Geraldine about jurisdiction or place of residence, and I'll ask Sarah Pesh to field this question, which is to ask, would all members of a scheme, once accredited, be certified regardless of jurisdiction within which they reside or principally practice, or would it only be New South Wales?
Thanks, Ben, for that. It's a good question. In fact, this has come up already in some earlier discussions that we've had with people on the scheme. At this stage, the way it'll work is the practitioners, the certified practitioners, they'll be part of a scheme regardless of jurisdiction. So if the EIA NZ scheme has members in Queensland, WA, etc., they will be recognised in New South Wales and will be able to operate. The focus that we've got with our areas for being identified in a scheme, they're not specific to New South Wales. So the skill set and qualifications experience won't be restricted to New South Wales, but what we would be expecting is a good understanding of the environmental requirements under our SSD and SSI schemes and what's required for an EIS. So you can pretty much operate in any jurisdiction and be considered a REAP so long as you're under an accredited scheme, and you can do it remotely. So that also helps with our COVID situation. A lot of people will be operating certainly for this year and possibly for following years remotely, doing a lot of this kind of work. And certification is probably something which can be done remotely, because it really is a pulling together of a lot of field work and other pieces, and there won't be any restriction that they be operating outside of or inside New South Wales, I should say.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I've got some somewhat of a related question, or perhaps follow-up question for Felicity from Warwick as well, Felicity. And the question asks, will a REAP be required to demonstrate skills consistent with QA auditing capabilities? So it's obvious they're capable of vetting and interrogating the bona fides of the EIS before them.
Yes, I think in short, one of the key roles of a REAP, I think, is making sure that there's a clear, very clear understanding from all the sub-consultants around the parameters of the project, because as you would all know, making sure that everyone's singing from the same song sheet of the scope of the project, but also ensuring that, and this goes, I think, to the level of experience for the REAP, that having an understanding of a broad range of technical areas and being able to interrogate those various kind of technical areas, be it biodiversity, be it, you know, air quality, or the like. Having expertise and experience in being able to interrogate and synthesize any of those individual technical studies, but also having that overall coordination and synthesis role is very much a requirement of a REAP. And I think, as I said, that goes to the rationale behind you can't just have somebody 1 or 2 years out of uni doing that role. You need someone with sufficient experience to do that role.
Thanks very much, Felicity. I think really interesting question come in from Hugh, and this is, I think, one equally for DPI, but perhaps also Paul. But the question is directed at DPI, and it's how will DPI manage frivolous or politically driven complaints, such as those from dissatisfied stakeholders? And I presume that means to be complaints about a REAP or an EIS that's been submitted to the department. And I'll ask Felicity if you could field that one for us.
Thanks for that, Ben. Look, I don't think there's any of us that would imagine that you ever, you know, that you'll ever disallow any kind of frivolous complaint coming in. All that you can really do is develop a scheme and a process and a system that is robust, it's transparent, and you know, doesn't hide from responding to and has appropriate mechanisms to deal with complaints and issues that do come up, even if they are frivolous, because frivolous ones will come, because land use and land use planning and development and environmental impact assessment is a contested space. And particularly for major projects, they're the biggest and most significant projects across the state, and people feel deeply and passionately about them. So I think all we can do collectively across this sector is ensure that the department establishes a rigorous and robust scheme. The organisations have appropriate mechanisms in place to deal with complaints and processes to evaluate those, and that our documentation is transparent.
Great, thank you, Flix. Moving on to a question on a slightly different nature from Ari. And Brian, I might ask this question of you, if that's okay. Is there a measure to ensure that the REAP practitioner is involved throughout the EIS development and not just at the end for certification?
Thanks, Ben. I don't think there is a measure as such. It's certainly our preference and the intent of the scheme that the certification is not an end of process method, but the person who is certifying is heavily involved from the start of the project in terms of scoping and working with the design teams, working with the specialists, and so that they can certify the project at the end with genuine knowledge of having been involved. But I think it would be difficult to have a clear measure around that, but that's certainly something we can consider as we develop the guideline in response to exhibition submissions.
Thanks, Brian. I think that's pretty clear to me, and I think there's an interesting question here that I might ask as a follow-up, if that's okay, because it's somewhat related, which is to ask, is there an expectation that REAPs are accountable for technical accuracy and correctness of EIA and as specialist assessments, or is there responsibility to ensure that the relevant technical expertise has been used and QA processes have been applied to assure technical correctness?
Yeah, that is a good question, and so many of you will have been involved in or led EISs and applications as have I, and I think you build up knowledge over the years of other disciplines that you work with on a regular basis, like air quality and noise and biodiversity. But even after my 20 odd years doing it, I still don't understand what happens in an air quality model or a noise model. So I think really the role here, it's a fine line, but the technical specialist for noise or air or whatever else must take responsibility for their own product. But the certifier should have a good understanding of the outputs of that, be able to spot any glaring inaccuracies, but really the important function is to take that technical output and make sure it is summarized accurately into the EIS, that it's done consistently with the project description, and that it is presented in a way that can be easily understood and accessed by a non-technical reader.
Great, thank you, Brian. A further question about jurisdiction questions and also that I think the department's approach to its intended process for scheme accreditation. And Sarah, I may ask this question of you since I've already gone to you about the jurisdiction question, if that's okay. And the question is from Richard to ask, what about overseas accreditation, such as the USA NEPA certification as an equivalent assessment-based certification?
Thanks, Ben. So at this point, when we will be going out seeking applications from organisations to apply to be accredited REAP schemes. We're in the process at the moment of discussing how we do that. We know we want to do this quickly because we want to be able to have at least a few schemes identified early in the piece so that we can get uptake of members and that we can get the scheme sort of rolling so that the volume of SSD and SSI projects that we have on an annual basis can be serviced pretty quickly. But at this stage, there are a few schemes that we're aware of that we're imagining will probably be applying to be accredited. We haven't looked outside Australia as yet, but actually, I would probably even put this question potentially to Brian, but my understanding is there's probably domestically enough of a pool of expertise where we can really get the numbers we need. But we'll see how we go, and we'll see what organisations put forward to be considered for accreditation as well. We haven't closed the door on any particular organisation, and it is a fresh idea from us, so we really need to see what's out there. I think that you mentioned, Ben, in the question, was it recognition, or it was sort of like the question of whether if you're got an overseas membership, whether it would be recognised across borders. The way the legislation will work is we will be naming specific schemes in the regulation, and those will be the schemes that will be recognised REAP schemes. So we won't be setting up, at this stage anyway, we won't be setting up any sort of recognised alignment with other schemes. They will need to go through a New South Wales accreditation process, and then the schemes that meet our requirements will be identified in the regulations. So there won't be any doubt as to which schemes are considered to be REAP schemes.
That's great. Thanks very much, Sarah, for that response. I've got a comment that I'll jump to now from David, a comment and also a question which I'll put to Felicity, if that's okay, Felicity. And you mentioned the CalDAS report earlier in the presentation, and David's noted that we've mentioned the CalDAS report. However, David's noted that the report only recommended the consideration of the South Australian scheme for accreditation, which is noted as much different. The South Australian scheme adopted applies to council and department assessors and not practitioners preparing documents. Is there a reason the South Australian approach wasn't adopted?
Thanks for that question. Perhaps I should have been a little bit more careful with my words, in that I guess it is this proposal is addressing, in our view, the CalDAS report in part, but certainly not in full, as you've pointed out. There are obviously many different accreditation schemes, and we have been doing some cross-jurisdictional analysis, and obviously analysis also within our own bailiwick. We've been looking at the EPA's accredited auditor scheme, the biodiversity assessment scheme, and so we are looking at the various ways in which these things can be set up, and certainly looking at where some of the pitfalls are on other schemes, and trying to get the best fit for government and DPI at this stage. So this is, I guess, where we've arrived at the proposal. It isn't exactly like the South Australian scheme, you're right, but we think it's got the, I guess, appropriate mix, particularly to address environmental impact assessment for major projects in particular. We think we've got a pretty good mix here. I'm not sure if that goes far enough, but yeah.
Thanks, Felicity. I think that's a fair response, but we can obviously follow up after the session if any of the people in the session would like for us to do that. I'm just mindful of time as well, so I know we've come to the end of the hour. I know we've got a bit of extra time up our sleeve, but I might just look through the questions we've got and see if I can pull together some questions with a little bit of commonality in their themes. And I've got a question from Helen and also from Warwick about questions about the REAP, and in particular from Helen, if a complaint is to be laid against a REAP, for example, like a quality issue, will the scheme or will DPI handle it, and what consequences might apply? And the second, I guess, question, which I think is similar thematically, is will the REAP be legally liable for the decision they make on an EIS? I should just point out the REAP won't be making a decision on an EIS, rather they'll be certifying an EIS, but Brian, I might throw to you to speak to some of those points.
Thanks, Ben. So the department's role will be to assess the EIS as normal. If a complaint is lodged against the practitioner who has certified the EIS, that complaint will be assessed by the relevant professional scheme or professional organisation administering the scheme. They have existing procedures in place to do that, and we'll be looking to see evidence of how those will work when they make their applications. From government's perspective, if a complaint is lodged against a practitioner who has certified an EIS, the EIS process, the assessment of that will continue as normal. What we would expect is that the professional organisation would have the processes and the resources, so importantly the resources as well, to assess and close out that complaint as quickly as possible, which is in everyone's interest to clear it up as quickly as possible. If what I think would be in an unlikely or rare situation where there is some substance to the complaint, well then obviously there would have to be a conversation between government and the professional scheme. But on the basis of just a complaint, the application process continues, and we're looking for the professional organisation to review and close that out as quickly as possible.
Thanks very much, Brian. I have a question from Esther, and the question relates to the period of experience, which is something that we've been talking about as well. And the question from Esther that I'll throw to Felicity, if okay, Felicity, is 10 years is a long period of previous experience. Will consideration be given to practitioners who've worked extensively with EIS applications? And I think that the theme here is it one of pure prescription, or will there be some kind of room for more merit-based or exception type consideration? If that's okay, Esther, to take that interpretation.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. I think this has been already one of the most hotly debated proposed criterias, and so it's clear that yeah, there is a range of views in this area. I think, and genuinely we're very keen to understand if perhaps it should be adjusted to the wording to be adjusted, say for example, for the biodiversity scheme. I think the period is 7 years, and so we're actively looking at this issue, or if the wording needed to be adjusted to recognise more that practical component, or the like. I guess the long and the short of what I'm trying to say is, I think we are firmly of the view that it has to be, you know, a lengthy period, certainly greater, I think, than you know, a couple of years. But we are open to looking at this particular criteria and whether it needs to be reworded to accommodate you know, some of that more practical experience that people would gain, that may not necessarily, for instance, have you know, a straight up and down background in environmental impact assessment, but have years of experience in the field.
Thanks very much, Felicity. I think Felicity's answer there kind of went some way to answering some similar questions that have been put forward by Jackie and also Zoe. Before we move on, I'm mindful of time, so I just perhaps, Paul, I might check in with you to see how you'd like us to proceed at this point. We're happy to keep going, but I'm mindful of everyone else's time, and if indeed you think that we need to wind up, we'd naturally be happy to take these questions away and answer them outside of session.
That's one option, we can do that, and also just wanted to highlight that the presentation slides will be circulated to all those that registered for the event, post-event. If there's any last questions, we could cover them off. Otherwise, we can continue offline.
Okay, Paul, that sounds great. Why don't I go through a couple more? I know there's been people waiting patiently for a little while now to get their questions answered, and I think there's another really good question from Warwick, which is to ask, and Felicity, I might ask this question of you as well. How does DeepI propose to avoid a repeat of the flaws in the independent certifier program for the building industry? Many such service providers have been captured by the builder and thus compromised the process and let the broader community down.
Thanks, Warwick, for that one. And I'm fortunate, I guess you could say, enough to have some a good experience in the building policy area, and certainly sitting on the building codes board, had first-hand experience in the particular pitfalls in that area. As I said, we are looking at other schemes and how they've been developed, how they're administered, and we certainly already understand the importance of the role of the department in the relationship with the scheme operators, but again, in the sense of as well, in administering the regulation, the planning system, and in auditing the operation of the scheme. That will be a very important role for the department to ensure the ongoing integrity of the system. So we will be monitoring complaints that and how those complaints are being dealt with by the organisations. We will be looking for trends if there's particular sectors or types of EISs or geographical locations, all those things. These are the sorts of, when auditing and reviewing the operation of the schemes, that's the sort of thing the department will be carefully looking at and trying to avoid any pitfalls of the past or operation of other schemes.
Thanks very much, Felicity, and I'll go to the last question now. I know there's still some that we haven't got to answering, and we will certainly endeavour to come back to answer any of those questions that we don't manage to get to. And I'm going to ask the question from Marcus, because I think Marcus has been waiting patiently for a little while. I'll put this one to Brian if I can, and this is to ask Brian, where do specialists, for example, ecologists, fit into the scheme?
Thanks, Ben. So the specialists will carry out their own work in accordance with their own technical methodologies. Some of those specialist areas, for example, contamination, have got their own accreditation schemes at the moment. The role of the specialists do not fit into the REAP scheme directly, in that the purpose of the REAP scheme is to have the EIS certified against certain criteria by a suitably qualified practitioner. But that practitioner, as we mentioned earlier, will interact with the specialist to make sure that their work is accurate to the extent that they can delve into the technical methodology. But ultimately, it's the specialist who carries out that work. But more importantly, integrating it and summarising it accurately into the EIS and making sure it's accessible to a non-technical reader.
Oh, great. Thanks very much, Brian. And thanks also to Sarah and not least Felicity for providing those responses. As mentioned, we'll review all of the questions and provide follow-ups outside of session if we haven't been able to get to your question during the session. But at this point, Paul, I might hand back to you. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. And look, I apologise. I had a rubbish truck going past when Brian was responding about the question on complaints. So I didn't quite get the fullness. I guess just wanted to, if it wasn't covered, add that when it comes to quality of reports, that's not something that we would handle as the certification scheme. We would handle the complaints against the personal ethics, code of conduct, things like that. And we follow that through a step-by-step process. Thank you to everyone for joining us all today. We really appreciate the department and joining us. Everyone that's participated in this. I hope it has been a little bit more helpful for those wanting to learn some more information. It's, as noted, is still a work in progress, and the finalisation requirements are still coming down as some of the questions have come across the, I guess, the experience levels. We will endeavour to support the department where possible. We do have a certification scheme that's there's multiple levels, and whether more than one of those levels is applicable at a later stage, I'm not sure, but you know, it's still early days in a way. We will package up the presentations and any other questions. Hopefully we can send some of those outstanding questions to the broader group when we send through the presentation. So thank you very much and have a nice day.